Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the dead zones for South of Midnight. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But to get into it, for movement we have a 32.5% axial dead zone, and that creates a central square of no movement. And because of its shape, you have to move further diagonally before you start seeing any movement in those directions. But axial dead zones apply to the entirety of the axis, and this creates regions of unregistered diagonal movement. So if your stick is anywhere within these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of four directions, in this case forward and backward, to the right, and to the left. You only start seeing diagonal movement when you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by this green region. And you might be able to see a pretty noticeable pivot between the cardinal movement and the diagonal movement, especially with the closer to the dead zone you get. And what seems to be happening here is there are two axial dead zones stacked on top of each other. One is a 25% axial dead zone that scales the input around it, and the other is a 10% axial dead zone that doesn't. And the unscaled axial dead zone, what that's essentially doing is, or specifically the 25% axial dead zone is offsetting the diagonals 25% off each axis. However, you don't lose any diagonals with that, but that additional 10% unscaled axial dead zone is actually eating those diagonals from 25% up to 32.5%. So those subtle angles are completely lost, and that's why you can see a pretty noticeable pivot in her diagonal movement. Losing 10% of the angles isn't too dramatic at full tilt, but can be very dramatic right around the dead zone, where you can see there's a very noticeable jump. And given that with axial dead zones it kind of moves to a point anyway, this would be pretty dramatic even if it were scaled, but with an unscaled axial dead zone, you're actually losing those angles entirely. For the movement curve, we have two speeds available with stick input. So we have a walk threshold right here, and then a shaded threshold representing the run threshold. And your walk speed is about 50% of the run threshold. And you can see that this is something of a rounded square shape. So for the diagonals, we have a radial threshold, and then flat thresholds for within these axial dead zones. And this run threshold actually also points towards that 10% axial dead zone. It's a little difficult to tell just from the video, but you can see that this is a very slight gear shape, and that's a telltale sign of this being implemented when you have an unscaled axial dead zone. What essentially happens is it expands this region of the cardinal straight ranges, but once you break out of this, you move into the radial portion, but it's cropped. So this radial threshold is scaled to a 25% axial dead zone, but that extra cardinal range that's offset from it is from that unscaled portion of the dead zone. But you also have a sprint option, and this can be triggered at any position outside of the dead zone. And this is a flat speed that isn't moderated by the stick magnitude. And this seems to be about 30% faster than your normal run speed. But for the camera, we have a 25% axial dead zone. And we have the same, well, actually slightly less restricted diagonal movement because we don't have the extra 10% axial dead zone on top of this. But you can see that I can bob around the vertical axis and the camera is moving perfectly horizontally. You only start seeing diagonal movement once you break out of both axis dead zones. And this is most easy to see by capping the view to the top, bottom or top like this, and looking for horizontal movement, which would be diagonal movement if it wasn't capped. And you can see here that without that unscaled axial dead zone, movements right past the axial threshold start very slowly, so you're not losing any diagonal movement with this specific implementation. But as far as the curve, we have a linear curve, so just a smooth progression from the dead zone to full stick tilt. It isn't clear how this curve is being implemented, either from distance from the center, at least relative to the dead zone, or from the distance off each axis relative to the axial dead zone, relative to the horizontal and vertical values specifically, rather than from the magnitude from the center of the dead zone. But that wouldn't matter for a linear curve. However, what's specifically here is you can see that my stick can lean outside of the circular graph here in the diagonals. And if I was able to move the stick to the full corner of the analog module, you would actually be able to move the camera faster diagonally, at least hit the maximum diagonal acceleration faster than the cardinal directions, and that's because they haven't clamped the extra magnitude. So if your stick was able to move that extra 40%, then you would actually get that extra speed. Otherwise, the horizontal and vertical camera speeds are different. And it seems like the vertical camera speed is about 40% of the horizontal, though take that with a huge grain of salt. Vertical tests are a little less accurate, and there's some pretty significant aim smoothing applied to the camera. There actually is an aim smoothing option, though unfortunately you can't fully remove smoothing. For those unaware, smoothing is a mechanic that causes your turn speed to build up over time. So you can see when I change directions, there's a slight lag where your turn speed has to build up to the speed you've selected. So this can make camera movements feel a little more sluggish because it's not starting at the speed that you're selecting or wanting it to start. You can reduce it. I don't know how to specifically test how fast the smoothing builds up, but you can reduce this to try to mitigate it. And it does speed up quite a bit faster, but there's still that slight lag in between the direction changes, so there's still some smoothing left over. And if you make very quick movements with your stick, they'll make very small adjustments, even though the full speed is pretty decent, because the speed doesn't have enough time to build up to its full speed because of the smoothing. So it's great there's an option, it's just unfortunate you can't fully remove it. And I've noticed that very occasionally there will be times where I'm just moving the camera around, and then it seems like if I was, say, moving to the left and it builds up fully, if I switch to the right, sometimes it maintains that speed, so it actually can get bursts of responsiveness that I'm not expecting. I'm expecting smoothing, and it completely kind of jumps around. There's probably some consistency to it, but basically all the times I've noticed it, it's been kind of jarring to me. But yeah, so it's good there's an option. It's just unfortunate that you can't fully disable it. But otherwise, that about covers things. We are given sensitivity options, and I don't know what the left stick sensitivity is. It doesn't seem to affect the curve. Perhaps it has something to do with the actual mechanics of her movement. Maybe this actually speeds up her kind of movement acceleration, how fast it changes directions, but I haven't been able to find out specifically what this slider does. But the right stick sensitivity is a pretty standard change in how fast you turn. But otherwise that covers things. So this is an Unreal Engine game, and Unreal seems to default to 25% axial dead zones. So we can probably blame the 25% camera dead zone as well as the underlying 25% axial dead zone for the movement on Unreal for that. The developers may not have implemented it and just passed the default through. However, they are using radial thresholds for the run threshold, which is good. However, the additional 10% axial dead zone that's cropping some of the angles is probably on the developers too. So on one hand, they're doing a good job with the radial threshold or the run threshold, but they've also accidentally eaten some of the diagonal movement and added additional restriction for movement on top of what Unreal's doing. Additionally, the camera acceleration is not capped for the diagonals, so that can be an issue, though given how most players' thumbsticks shouldn't reach the full corners of the module range, so they probably won't notice that extra speed, so that might not affect too much in their games. But otherwise, that about covers things, so thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.